Hey, everybody. Welcome back to week one of fantasy football. We're finally done all the games. You're back here with Sam and I. We're going to go through quite a bit of our thoughts after week one. I'm going to start this out and just ask you, Mr. Sam, what'd you think of week one in fantasy football?
I was very happy it's finally back. I've been waiting a little too long for this moment. Probably made
Yeah.
a few too many bad trades out of boredom, but overall, there were some good things that I saw week one. But it's kind of a disappointing fantasy week for a lot of teams and a lot of players, and we'll get
Yep.
into that soon. But
Yeah,
interesting week one.
it was pretty atrocious. As I was running through the numbers, I mentioned this to you earlier. There was only 31 players that eclipsed 20 points, which I thought was really, really jarring compared to what you usually see. You either got really lucky with people overperforming, or you were just sitting in a low score count game with a bunch of people that did almost nothing and hoping you won. I did not have a great fantasy week. I went 2-3.
Yeah. I think we're dealing with a lot of teams who don't play in the preseason, so shaking
Hmm.
off the rust, I think, over the next few weeks. Hopefully, some of our players that we picked on our teams start to kind of take off a little bit, but we'll see how it goes.
I hope so. It's early. Like week one, it's hard to judge really much of anything. So let's do that and just overreact to stuff. Uh,
I'm
so
great at that, so
you are very good at that, as you tried to trade everything away for Isaiah Likely right after the game. Let's jump into this first take, which I happen to like because I have him. Joe Mixon is going to have a monster year. He's going to finish as a top 10 RB.
yeah. I have to eat crow on this one a little bit. I was obviously wrong. Mixon was on my fade list for the year. He's been on my fade list for the last 2 or 3 years, I think,
Hmm.
at this point, and I've just continuously been wrong on him. And I think this year I will be the most wrong on him. Obviously, not a good offense. He's used pretty efficiently. They can't stack the box on him, and he doesn't look like he lost his legs at all. Like
No.
I'll admit I was very, very wrong on Mixon this year.
He looked remarkable on Sunday. He looked completely rejuvenated. Like he had more energy than he's had the last 2 years, and he wasn't even bad last year. Like he was a solid RB. It sucks because you look at your drafts and you're like, wow, I could have picked him up pretty late in a few drafts, and I had my eye on him in a few of them, and it just didn't fall my way where he just went like a few picks before I would have taken him in like two drafts. But I was blown away by how good he looked. He averaged 5.3 yards per carry. And he's what, 28, I think, at this point, which is that cliff
Yeah,
age. I was looking at some of the stats of like how he was doing, and it was really, really good. His burst looked fantastic. He was at a 0.59 yards over attempt, which is like he was pushing the piles forward and getting extra yards out of every single run. And he scored a touchdown. And clearly, the Texans have a lot of faith in him. I think he's going to have the benefit of having one of the best wide receiver cores around him. And you can see it on the field. It just opened up everything for him. You can't say the same about his former team. Um, Bengals look like hot garbage. It was not good. Burrow looked like trash. Chase had a good game, all things considered, with how the game went. But they really they look like how they started last year, which was really, really bizarre. But I don't think it's an overreaction to think Mixon is going to finish top 10. I would
yeah,
actually be surprised if he's not.
yeah. Now there's take good players on good teams, and good things will happen to you.
Yep. And the Texans are definitely going to get it done. Next reaction we have, and I don't know if this is too much of an overreaction or whatever, but Baker Mayfield finishing as a QB1. He looked really, really good last year, or this weekend. I mean, he looked good last year too. He had a Pro Bowl year, but this weekend I was watching some of that game because they came up pretty frequently on Red Zone, and he was making all of the right plays. Whether it was
Yeah,
taking off with his legs, throwing the ball into the slot. Godwin obviously had a really, really good game, reaped those benefits. checkdowns to Bucky or Rashad were doing well in each case. The Bucks looked good.
Yeah, the Bucks looked really good, and I wasn't sure if we'd see a little bit of a regression from Mayfield after Canales left, but he picked right back up where he left off. Um, and when we're looking at fantasy QBs, like after those like first 8 guys that typically all have like rushing upside and are pretty solid, like all around QBs, the next crop of like QB 8 through like 18, it's typically that range of like, pocket passers like the Goffs, the Tuas of the world, things like that. And for those, you really just got to look at situation. Tua's obviously going to be up there. Goff's going to be up there just because they have fantastic weapons around them that are going to get lots of receptions and put up touchdowns like after the catch. And I don't think Mayfield's any different. He has Evans. Godwin was remarkably better in the slot.
Yeah.
McMillan had he had the 1 touchdown and he had a few close calls.
Yep.
And they obviously have the running back corps to support him too. So I wouldn't be shocked if Mayfield is the best pocket passer in that group there.
Well, that's the thing. He's got some legs under him, too. Baker's always been mobile, and I think he gets undersold on it because he's not Josh Allen or Jalen Hurts or now Anthony Richardson and Jane Daniels, who's running all over the field on his first game. It makes it tough from the fantasy perspective for each of them in regards to the receivers, but as a QB, you know that they're going to show up for you. I loved what I saw from him all around. He looked good. The Bucks looked solid. I'm curious to see what they do in week 2. Like we said at the beginning of this video, it was only week 1. We don't want to get too crazy. This next one I think is pretty good, and then I got another one that you don't know about, Sam, that I'm going to jump in here. But first, the Detroit Lions wide receiver duo. Will they have 2 receivers finishing in the top 20? Is that hard to say right now? Because I think there's a good chance.
I think Jameson Williams, like you hear coach speak in the preseason all the time of just trying to like hype up their guys and make them sound better than what they are, maybe throw off an opponent going into like the first game of the season.
Yep.
But Williams was everything Dan Campbell said he became in the offseason. He was confident on his routes. He wasn't just used as like a sacrificial X, which is basically his role last year.
That's what
we just tried to.
to
Yeah, it was weird. It was I know Amon-Ra only had a handful of targets that game, but Jameson Williams was the first read on like 38% of Goff's dropbacks, which is huge. And he has the athleticism and like speed of a guy like Tyreek. Maybe that's a bit of an exaggeration. But if he has the sure hands, he has the athletic tools, like there's a chance he finishes like as one of the top weapons in this Detroit Lions offense this year.
Yeah, I mean, there's a big reason Jameson Williams was a target of mine in a lot of dynasty drafts. I've been high on him since he was drafted. Has his career started how I expected it to? No, not even remotely, as we both know. But there's a reason he was drafted where he was. And that's because he was a very, very talented receiver coming out of college. I think you guys got a taste of what he is capable of this past weekend. And I expect it to only go up from there. And what that's going to do is enable the Lions to just open up the field completely between him and Amon-Ra. And then you have Montgomery and Gibbs in the backfield. Like, that's just going to be stupid. Like, it's going to be completely stupid when it comes out to it. Their offense is going to be really good. Goff's going to be having a field day. I'm looking forward to seeing what next week does because, as you all know, Amon-Ra was quiet. Because play across the board was just not good for the most part, at least from a fantasy perspective. Only a handful of quarterbacks actually eclipsed 200 yards, which was really bizarre to me. I have the count here, and literally not even half the league eclipsed 200 yards passing.
Yeah, I mean, the Rams are a very good team too. They're like the Lions and the Rams will probably meet each other in the playoffs at some point this year. Would be my guess. So, yeah. We'll see how it turns out. The Lions offense, you just want to own players in it. Montgomery was a beast. Gibbs is very good out of the backfield receiving the ball. And I think they might have been easing him back in after the hamstring injury still. So I think he'll even have some bigger games coming up. It might just be one of those scenarios where there's too many mouths to feed and we'll see spike weeks in certain weeks for different players. I'm
Yep.
hoping they're good enough to support 5 fantasy assets, though.
Yeah, I agree. I think they are. If the Eagles can do it, so can the Lions. When it comes down to it, the Eagles did pretty good spreading it around to their weapons. I don't see why the Lions can't. And then I got my last one in here. Tell me if this is an overreaction or not, because this is me thinking this. The Bengals are not making the playoffs. I think they were predicted to make the playoffs by everybody. I don't see it. That game was awful.
Well, the Bengals have historically started slow under
Mm-hmm.
Zach Taylor. So there's a chance, obviously there are some concerns about Burrow being fully healthy with his wrist again and everything like that.
Mm-hmm.
There's issues with Chase's contract. Higgins wants out. I'd say it's possible, but my concern of saying that they won't make the playoffs is their division is the Browns with Deshaun Watson or maybe Jameis Winston in the near future. Um, Obviously, the Ravens will be top of that division, I think.
Yep.
But the
There's no doubt.
Steelers with Fields or Russ Wilson, ugh.
Hey, they won. Six field goals got them there, but they won.
I'm curious to hear what you have to say, but I think they have the path to get there.
I think they looked anemic, man. The offensive line did not look good. They have no running game. I know it was one game, but this is what I looked at. Chase Brown did not look good. And I know a lot of them have him as a sleeper and stuff, but I don't know if it's him or if it's offensive line. But it was atrocious. They clearly were missing Mixon extensively. It's been a huge drop off. No running game shuts down Chase because they know that the defenses are going to fall back. They're going to go into cover and they're going to just focus on Chase and Higgins. And Joe Burrow's going to be running around for his life all day, which is something he's really enjoyed doing his entire career as a Bengal so far, which is a shame because they cannot get that offensive line right. And that's the issue that I see is if that OL can't hold up, they're not going anywhere.
Yeah, and I guess we did bring up Mixon already. Maybe he was more important to that offense than we realized.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not there yet. I say give it a few weeks, see if the Bengals do their usual routine of looking terrible the first 4 weeks of the season, then turning it around. I'm holding for now, but I am a little nervous. I think that's fair to say.
I mean, you have to be. They didn't look good. You figure they're just taking a look here real quick. Their RB1 was Chase Brown, and he had a whopping 2.3 points in a fantasy perspective, which pretty much tied him with. He had 0.1 more points than Miles Sanders.
Pretty
Miles
good.
Sanders, and that is just that's not good. That's a,
Well, I think
all
Zach
right, hold on.
Moss got the
Zach
start.
Moss
for them.
had 12.1.
Yeah.
That's not good either.
Again, the Patriots are a good defense. For everything that the Patriots lack, they do
They
typically
did
have a
shut
good
them down.
defense.
I agree with that. It was just brutal. I am glad I avoided Joe Burrow in my drafts this year.
Yeah.
That I'll leave it at that. I am glad I do not have to worry about having him. I have Chase, obviously in one of my dynasty leagues. I'm not worried about him. I know he'll get his. But Burrow, I'd be raising some flags in alarming ways right now. Okay, let's jump into some injury news. There are obviously a few big injuries in week one, some more alarming than others, but we obviously want to touch on some of the big ones. Let's start on the game that Sam and I were both watching because we're Birds fans. Jordan Love at the end of the game tweaking his knee. It was brutal. Obviously, it's come out that it's an MCL strain. He's expected to miss 3 to 6 weeks. I hate seeing stuff like this, especially at the end of a game. You all hate Birds fans, but we don't want to win because your QB got hurt, or your running back got hurt, or your wide receiver. We don't want to win because of injury. I think we're going to win either way, whether it was out there for the last 30 seconds or what. It's really just not enough time to do anything in most cases. But I hated to see that. I felt awful because you could just see it as soon as he went down, he was in immense pain. It's a shame. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, the silver lining here is that it wasn't ACL tear, which is what a lot of people were
Yeah,
fearing when
or
he
any
went
tear for
down.
that matter.
Yeah, the MCL sprain. So silver lining, it was the best case scenario for what happened to his knee on that final
Yep.
play. He'll be back in 3 to 6 weeks. They're not even putting him on the IR, so I think that indicates maybe close to that 3 or 4 week timeline there.
Yeah.
Obviously feel bad. As far as fantasy implications go,
Yep.
the Green Bay wide receiver room was already a massive question mark going into the season, and we are not going to get
My boy
any
Reed
answers on
showed up
that.
for me.
Reed was great. Reed looked great, but are you going to start Reed with
No.
Malik Willis? Exactly. So, yeah. So I think for the time being, Green Bay as a whole is an avoid. Maybe you still start Josh Jacobs, but
Yeah, he's going to get his. But the
they're
defensive
going to
backs
have
will
to.
win on him.
Exactly. They'll stack the box.
Mhm.
We'll see what happens. For the time being, I'm not very confident in any Green Bay Packer in my starting lineup.
Yeah, I agree. Obviously, guys, if you're looking for pickups and replacements for Jordan Love, you should still have some solid QB options. One we already mentioned, Baker Mayfield, may be available. I would definitely be looking at someone like him as a potential pickup. In a lot of redraft leagues, there's going to be a lot of opportunity. In your dynasty leagues, hopefully you have someone on your bench because odds are you're not going to find one on the waiver wire or you're going to have to make a trade. It's unfortunate. Next one, and this one doesn't seem so bad. Jake Ferguson obviously went down in his game. Looks like he has a bone bruise in his knee. They don't know if he's going to play this week. Apparently, there's a chance he's going to play this week, but the odds are he won't.
Yeah. Another guy where he got lucky and avoided something that looked like it was going to be much worse.
Yep.
It's if you have Jake Ferguson, if you drafted him, he's probably your starter. You might not even have a backup tight end on the bench, so it gets a little tough. Obviously, if he's on your waivers, you're probably spending a lot of fab on Isaiah Likely if Ferguson is your starting tight end.
Clear replacement, yeah.
Yeah,
Hey, Colby
outside
Parkinson might be a good grab too.
yeah, Colby Parkinson could be a good backup option there. I think the Cowboys, though, if Ferguson is out, I think you'll just see a bigger game week for Brandon Cooks. I don't necessarily think their backup tight end is going to come in and have a big role for them.
Who is their backup tight end now? I don't even know.
It's Parkinson, right?
Parkinson? It might be. It might be.
Or Shoemaker.
Well, Colby Parkinson's on the Rams.
That's what, Shoemaker, I think, is the backup tight end for them.
Yeah, he's on the Rams. I think he's going to be a good grab, Colby Parkinson, because I think he's probably going to be available in most leagues. But obviously, if you are paying attention to fantasy, like the tight end position in week one, outside of Isaiah Likely, really was awful. Most of you are not going to go out and pick up Foster Moreau, who had a decent game because the Saints walked all over in their game. You're just not going to do anything. You're just going to sit there. But Likely would be the number one pickup. But odds are, by today, he's already been picked up. So
Yeah, your whole league's going for him. So
yeah, unless you're in Fab, in which case you're going to be bidding probably pretty heavy of a price on him, and you have to justify whether or not that's worth it. I'll be surprised. Most people have 100 Fab. I wouldn't be surprised if some people are bidding 50 Fab on this guy, trying to get him in week one. I'm not sold on him doing what he did every single week. It's not going to happen. Mark Andrews is going to get his. Mark Andrews out snap counted him, which we will touch on. It's not going to happen. I'm telling you, is he worth 51 of your Fab in one game? Decisions to make. Obviously, if you're trading for him, it's a different conversation. Next one, which was crappy to see, Puka. They came out today and said that he has a knee sprain. He's going on the IR. He's expected to miss 3 to 6 weeks, most likely with the knee sprain. That sucked. He tried to come back and play. You can see he came back on the field at halftime, and then he didn't even walk off the field at the end of the half. He had to get carted off. It was the same knee that he injured in preseason, that he just couldn't shake that injury. He clearly just was not ready. He's going to be missing some time.
yeah, no, it's unfortunate. Obviously, if you took Puka, he's probably end of the first round, early second round, where he was going. So that's a big hole to fill in your roster. If you need to pick someone up, if you're looking at the Rams offense, I think Ty Johnson looked pretty good.
Yeah, he
Um,
should be available
he was
too.
should be available. I don't think he's going to have crazy fad bids on him either.
Hmm.
Um, I'm not too excited about him though. I think it's pretty clear the implication of this injury
Kupp.
is Cooper Kupp is going to be a wide receiver one, like no doubt.
Yeah,
He
he looked
got
good too,
14
despite that.
receptions.
Even
Yeah,
when Puka was in the game, Kupp looked refreshed, which was really, really nice to see. But replacing Puka is tough. It always sucks when you lose your first or second or even third round pick in fantasy because
yeah,
you definitely rely heavily on them. Um, I think Tyler Johnson's going to be grabbed. I've seen a lot of waiver pickups of him. He's being one of the most picked up. I'm not sold. If you guys are wondering here, I'm not saying you should go out and pick up Alan Lazard, who just had a garbage game, even though he had a lot of points. A lot of it was garbage. Um, or Alec Pierce. I would not be rushing to the waiver to pick him up either. He just kind of happened to catch two bombs, and that's what it was. There are plenty of options on the waiver wire for you guys to go after and hopefully pick up in your redraft leagues. If you are sitting in a dynasty league, the pickings are going to be a little bit slimmer. You're most likely going to have to start someone from your bench or make a trade. The next one, which surprised everybody, and it was really funny because I was watching the post game news conference, and for those who can guess who I'm talking about, we're talking about CMC, and they were interviewing Jordan Mason, and they asked Mason like when he found out he was going to start, because obviously the news of the calf injury didn't come out until like an hour before the game or something like that. And this is why if you're on Sleeper, it's fantastic that they had that sub stuff in play because that was an hour before. What are you going to do? You're screwed on a Monday night. Like there's
yeah,
nothing you can do, right? So other fantasy apps get on your. This is why I voted it in every single league I was in for that exact situation. It's a prime example. Unless Jordan Mason was available, you were done. You're cooked because there's nothing you can do. And Mason was just like, he got asked the question of when he found out about starting, and he said, "See, this is why I can't talk to y'all." He goes, I'm not going to answer that question. We're going to move on to the next one. You guys all like to spin words. And he
yeah.
just
That's
avoided the question entirely because odds are he found out before an hour before the game, right? Like they're probably been planning for it, but they didn't want to let the other team know. Rightfully so. I get it, right? It was just really, really funny watching that interaction with him in the media. But yeah, the injury, CMC, calf strain, that could linger.
Yeah, no, I mean Jordan Mason, obviously, he looked good with the carries that he got. He didn't really miss a beat. Niners are a good team. They're going to be a good team
Yeah.
even without CMC. But that said, Purdy and his production and the wide receiver production of the 49ers always drops when CMC's not available. And we
Yeah.
saw that a little bit last night. Debo obviously had the touchdown, but none of the wide receivers had like a crazy good game from a fantasy perspective. So that's the one thing I'm most worried about if CMC misses extended time.
Yeah, I think Jawan Jennings led the receivers in receiving yards,
Yeah.
which says everything. I think when it comes down to it, it was painful. I mean, that game last night was painful to watch in general. I know San Francisco put up 32 points. It didn't feel like they scored 32 points. Like it was just a boring game. Which was a lot of games this weekend. I mean, obviously, I loved watching Red Zone and stuff like that, but the games felt slow. I don't know if it's just me or if you felt something similar, but
I think it's week one rust, is what it can be boiled down to. So,
yeah, that's my guess. Everyone's shaking off, getting their things together. Obviously, the Jets looked weak. Rodgers didn't look terrible. He's obviously shaking off his rust when it comes down to it. Brees Hall looked like Brees Hall, but neither team could really get anything going outside of Jordan Mason just popping off. Last injury, Njoku on the Browns. I know some people definitely picked him up this year in the draft because he had a crazy end of year last year where he just went off and probably won some fantasy leagues for people. But he is week to week right now. They won't disclose what the injury is, even though some people are insinuating that it might be a high ankle sprain. If it is a high ankle sprain, there's a very low probability of him playing. Is that an issue
I don't know.
with the Browns?
Deshaun Watson and the Browns look so terrible. I'm probably not starting anyone on that team outside of Jerome Ford. That's the only player I'll touch. The Browns still have a good O-line. Like, they're going to give Jerome Ford enough opportunities to be fantasy relevant. But Deshaun Watson is just so terrible. I'm not touching Judy. I'm not touching Cooper. Elijah Moore shouldn't be on any fantasy roster at this point anyway. I think the Browns are just a tough team to trust from a fantasy perspective.
Yeah, across the board. Like, I'm starting Cooper because he, despite all that, had a good year last year. I expect him to still get his as a wide receiver 1, but I wouldn't start anybody else outside of Ford on that team. And trust me, Cooper's fringe for me too. It's the state of the fantasy team where you have to play him because of who the other options are at that point.
Right.
Obviously, if you're in a redraft league, I'd be looking for potential replacements to just bench him a little bit until either Deshaun Watson changes into Jameis Winston, which is someone I'd probably rather have starting if I were them right now. It's a shame, man. Obviously, I know he had the court case. I'm not going to judge whether it was right, wrong, if he did it or didn't, but he's a shell of what he was before he was out. Because he was a stud on the Texans. He was everyone was taking him in fantasy back then, and then he came back and he just looks like Daniel Jones.
No, I guess
Jones
karma's a
everywhere,
bitch.
man.
So
there was I was watching jokes going around where they were talking about how Barkley has more touchdowns than Daniel Jones in one game with the Eagles, and Daniel Jones does this year and last year.
that's pretty rough. Or Daniel Jones has thrown more touchdowns to opposing teams than the Giants since he signed his contract.
I don't get it. But speaking of the Giants, though, if Robinson, if you can get Wandell, I would pick him up. If you're looking for a waiver wire ad, I think Wandell is definitely one of the players to target. But oh my God, awful! Like it was comical to watch the Giants, and it was almost painful to watch them as well. It's a shame. It just makes you wonder what they were thinking when they signed Daniel Jones and didn't sign Saquon. It's mind-boggling. Okay. Moving on, after injury news, I want to get into just some statistics-based stuff. And by statistics, I just mean some stats. So I'm going to share my screen. So one of the things you want to highlight when you are talking fantasy is, and this isn't an end-all, be-all indicator, guys, but snap count can be a little bit of a tell of how much a team trusts a player. Now, this is one game. So these could be a little skewed. Was the team winning a ton? Meaning their starters got benched and they're just not playing. So you got to take that into consideration here. But when you look outside of that, there are definitely some interesting highlights that you could take a look at. Like, I thought this one was really silly, but Andre Lascivis played 100% of the snaps for the Bengals. Not Jamar Chase, not T. Higgins, not Irvin. Like, what?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a interesting one to point out, though, just because a lot of people picked up Jermaine Burton later in leagues. And I think he had like a 1% snap share.
Yeah, because he had like a few plays.
Like Yoshivas should not be a starter on any fantasy team, but if Higgins was to miss extended time, maybe he's an interesting waiver wire grab.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, right? As we come down here, you got a lot of the normal people that you'd expect to be here. For those of you worried about Marvin Harrison Jr., I don't. There's nothing to worry about. Okay, he's going to get his. It's going to happen. He is clearly the wide receiver 1, despite what we saw with Dortch getting the majority of the catches, which was crazy because I just had to start him this week, and he actually gave me a return. I was not terribly upset about it. Going through this list, all right, things that stand out to me aren't really on the first page. Okay, If there's one thing to highlight here, it's the Texans. Everyone was curious as to how that wide receiver core was going to look. Nico Collins was clearly the wide receiver one. Snap count, he was sitting there at about 80% of the snaps, which is what you expect for a wide receiver one. Usually you want to look at 75% plus, 80% plus. Stephon Diggs was just behind him at about 77%. And then you have to go into the 60s to see Tank Dell coming in at 63%. So he was out there the least out of all three of those guys. It showed if you watch the game. Diggs had a really good game. Nico Collins had a really good game. I'm not saying Dell had a bad game, but he was clearly the third when it came down to it.
Yeah. No, Nico's the guy to own. He made some amazing catches. He's clearly the number one deep threat in that offense. Diggs, I think, is going to be touchdown dependent, I think, is what it's going to turn into. But obviously, big red zone threat, not completely washed after what we thought might be his downfall with Buffalo at the end there.
Yep.
And like you said, Dell probably going to have a handful of spike weeks here and there, just because CJ Stroud does like him. He does throw to him deep a lot. Like he'll have like some of those big touchdown runs. Yeah. But in redraft, I don't think he's going to be a viable week in, week out option.
You know what? Another thing that I want to highlight here is the Bills. People were obviously going into the season like who's the wide receiver one on the Bills. Coleman led target share, and by that I mean snaps. He was out there for 73% of the snaps, which is a solid count, especially for a rookie wide receiver, because a lot of the rookies were not there when it came down to it. The next closest Buffalo player when it came to snaps was, where is he? Mac Hollins at 58.1, and then Khalil Shakir at 53. I know a lot of people have Shakir as a sleeper. You're out there 50% of the snaps, one every two. I was blown away. Now, I know it was a close game. Allen was obviously scoring all the touchdowns. God forbid he let someone else score. But yeah, it was interesting to watch that.
Yeah, Shakir's probably in a lot of like wide receiver three wide receiver sets. Looks like Hollins is the other outside wide receiver.
Former Bird.
The other thing called, I know he's not on this list, but Dalton Keene, dud performance, and we'll talk about this a bit later. But he was out there, I think, 80% of the snaps still, roughly. So it was, if you drafted Dalton Keene, you drafted him as a top 5 tight end this season. For my rest of the season rankings, I still have him there. It was one game where the Bills were chasing the Cardinals up until the fourth quarter. I think it was a weird game. What options do you have? You probably don't have a better option than Dalton Keene on your team if that's who you drafted. So,
well, yeah, he's usually going in top 5 rounds in most drafts. I was shocked, but you expected him to eat because of the wide receiver core. But the team did not look good. I know they won because of Allen just being all over the place. But I was very, very surprised. But speaking of, tight ends, here are the snap counts for the tight ends. And if you come down here to someone like Baltimore, which everyone was talking about, Andrews and Likely. Andrews led the snap share. This isn't surprising. Okay? He's going to continue to lead the snap share. He is a big reason that Likely got what he did. I just want to emphasize that a little bit. Okay? Him and, if you look at the counterpart, Kelce, Andrews and Kelce kind of played similar roles in their respective games, where they were taking so much coverage away from everybody else that it opened up the field, especially on the Chiefs. Like, you could just see the openings for Rice, Worthy, Justin Watson. Like, it just opened up the field because people were so focused on Kelce. It was actually kind of crazy to actually watch. And it worked through and through for both teams.
Yeah, the Chiefs obviously wanted to take Andrews away the whole game. You could see it with how they were passing him off to the linebackers.
Yeah.
But he was used in a lot of blocking sets. He
Mm-hmm.
wasn't really targeted that much either.
It
And I
wasn't.
know that might have been part of the game plan. I do like Likely more than you do.
Mm-hmm.
I think he was drafted. He's basically a wide receiver in a tight end's body
Yeah.
when he was drafted. And a lot of tight ends, they take a few years to really grow into the league and grow into like their role in an offense. I do think there's a chance this is likely his breakout season.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't mean Andrews is irrelevant and puts up 0 to 5 points every week,
Mm-hmm.
but I do think it hurts Andrews' rest of season. He might not be this bad, but I don't think he's what you hoped he would be when you drafted him, is what I'll say. What I'll
Yeah,
say if
sure.
you can
I
pivot
get
out.
what you're saying. Yeah, I'm big on Andrews. I think Andrews is going to do what he does every year when it's all said and done. I also think that if I look at the Ravens, that there's a good chance that Likely and Andrews lead that team in receiving. As crazy as that sounds, I would not be surprised. You're going to see a lot of two tight end sets on Baltimore. It's going to happen constantly, and it happened constantly this past weekend. They were each in the high, Likely right here was at 66%, while Andrews was at 74%. They're out there a lot running two TE sets. I think one of the things that was really crazy to me, like looking at the tight end play this weekend, was how unused Evan Ingram was. I don't know what Jacksonville was doing. I mean, they blew that game when it came down to it. I have all the love in the world for Doug Peterson, but I don't know like what they were doing. The offense just kind of imploded across the board in that second half. And Ingram, who was a really, really good tight end last year, kind of took the brunt of it all. He wasn't used. He was not there for 70% of the snaps. And the offense just did not look good really at all.
No, yeah, Brian Thomas, that's the only person I'm really interested in that offense.
Yeah, he has
Um,
game.
Even ETN lost a lot of snaps to Tank Bigsby,
Yep.
who he looked pretty good.
He did.
Tank Bigsby is probably a deep league waiver wire grab this week for
Mm-hmm.
you. But yeah, Jacksonville overall, one of the offenses I'm most disappointed in. I think Lawrence's name gives him a lot more credit than he deserves based off how he's played for the past several years.
I mean, 2 years ago he was good. Last year, not so good.
Right.
He's definitely had a very up down career, and it's really hard to gauge because like he doesn't really have a wide receiver one. Kirk is not a
Yeah.
wide receiver one. He's not. He's a wide receiver two, and he's a decent wide receiver two on a team where he'll give you some really good games, and then he'll have average games the majority of the time. People expected Ridley to fill that role last year. Ridley's not what he was. I know he's got good legs, but I would consider him a wide receiver too right now, which isn't a bad place to be. I still think it's a solid fantasy play. But they don't have a Jamar Chase or an A.J. Brown or a Devontae Smith or a T. Higgins. T. Higgins would have been great for him. Like if he ended up managing to get free and Jacksonville could have picked him up. They need a wide receiver one. Lawrence needs some help as far as receiving goes. Now, I'm not saying he's been perfect on his end, but because he hasn't looked great. He hasn't looked as like the next quote unquote like Peyton Manning that people were deeming him to be when he came into the league. But yeah, it's just interesting. All right. There's obviously like a lot more we could pull away from different stats, but we're not going to get into all the nitty gritty of this stuff. Let's jump into studs and duds from week 1, shall we? So I'll let you
Let's do
kick
it.
this section off here, Sam.
Yeah, so for the first stud that we already mentioned Baker Mayfield in our instant reactions for the week, so we'll go a different direction here. But our first stud QB is going to be Anthony Richardson. He's what we were hoping he would be. He has a massive arm talent. He's going to rush the ball. He only completed 9 passes, but finished with around 30 fantasy points. So he's going to be one of those QBs. He might not be great in real life, but he's going to put up a couple of 80-yard touchdowns, passes to Alec Pierce or Adonai Mitchell or Josh Downs and Pittman when they come back. He's going to rush for 50, 60 yards and probably a touchdown most games of the year. He's going to be a fantasy beast when it comes to being a QB. I like him a lot. Whether or not he's a great real-life QB, I think is a different conversation.
I know. And we were talking about this before we put this together, and I'm like, outside of the 2 bombs that he connected with Pierce for, he looked awful throwing the ball. And that's a shit, because he's got a cannon. That ball is so clean on his release. He had the second lowest completion percentage in the NFL in week 1. He came in at 47.4% of his passes. The only person that was worse than him, you want to take a wild guess?
Bryce Young.
Bryce Young was at 43.3. Caleb Williams was at 48.3. So not much better. And then you get into the guys like Deshaun Watson, who was at 53. And Daniel Jones, who was at 52. But 47% of your passes. But it just shows you why people drafted Anthony the wide. The reason they did was that guy's going to run all over the field. And he's going to give you rushing touchdowns. And he's going to have a lot of yards rushing. He finished as QB2. Or, QB4. At 27.1 points in PPR leagues.
Yeah, dude's a stud. I think he's got league-winning potential if you got him in like that 5th, 6th round there. So, obviously just an athletic freak, and that's going to carry his fantasy value the whole season.
Yep.
As far as the dud QBs go, we listed 2 for this. One's obvious. We won't spend too much time on it. Deshaun Watson. Just awful. He shouldn't be a starting QB anymore. He seems like a shadow of his former self. If that's probably an insult to shadows. The Browns are paying him. I wouldn't be shocked if Jameis Winston is the starter there in the next couple of weeks. That's how bad he was.
If they want to win, they're just really like in a tough spot with that contract. All that guaranteed money that they gave him. It's still mind-boggling to me. I can't get over it. Like when they did that contract coming back, I was like, oh man, what are they smoking?
Only the Browns could make it so that Deshaun Watson became a significantly worse player than Baker Mayfield.
Yeah.
It's such a Brown scenario. I can't even really. No, I could absolutely wrap my mind around it. They're one of the worst run franchises in history, although Carolina is now giving them a run for their money. But I don't know. They deserve it. They deserve all the horrible things happening with Watson and their franchise. They're just so poorly run. It's hard to find any redeeming qualities there.
You got to feel bad for their fans. You really do. Who you got next?
Yeah, the other dud QB we have, and this is a disappointing one for me, although I'm still holding on hope for the rest of the season, unlike I am for Watson, was Caleb Williams. Only had around 7 fantasy points. Again, like you just mentioned, like 48% completion rate, only about 9 completions, despite a lot of passing attempts. He just looked a little out of sync. His wide receivers had a couple of drops, but even with those, he just wasn't as accurate as he should have been. He wasn't making some of the crazy plays he made at USC. If anything, I hope this week kind of humbles him a bit and he realizes he can't be, Superman in the NFL every play and has to get a little bit better as like a pocket passer there.
I mean, the biggest alarming thing was the talent that's around him that you would have suspected just because of the talent at that receiver core that you would have seen more out of him. But it's week 1. Jaden Daniels is only as high as he is because of his rushing, which Williams, that's not what he does. He runs, but he's not like Jaden Daniels, who This 28.2 is deceiving too. It's just like Anthony Richardson. He was running all over the field. I think Williams will rebound. I'd be surprised, very, very surprised if he doesn't. He'll get it together. But it was really, really tough to watch him out there. And seeing things like Tyrod Taylor, who came in for the back end of the fourth quarter, almost have as many points as he did. It just shows you how rough of a day Chicago was. But in the end, the team came back. They were losing, and I can't believe they won that game. I really can't.
Yeah, shows you how bad Tennessee and the counterpart QB over there.
Yeah, they just imploded. I need
there
one more
were a couple
completion
of
from Will Levis in that game for my my bet. I'm reeling over here. All right, what do you got for wide receivers?
Wide receivers. So we had 3 studs here. The first that we had was Cooper Kupp. Again, we talked about this with the Puka injury, so we won't linger on too long. Puka's out. Kupp is just going to be a target and PPR monster. He is right back in that wide receiver 1 conversation, and I'm not hesitating at all to start him.
Mm-hmm.
And as far as the other wide receivers go, we had Chris Godwin and Jameson Williams. Williams, again, we talked about earlier. He has big play potential. He's getting more targets now.
Yeah.
He looks like he's an actual read in the offense. And Godwin was just
rejuvenated.
Back in the slot. I'll let you take this one if you have some thoughts.
Yeah, Godwin looked. I was kicking myself because I had him on the bench in my redraft league. He was on my bench. Not that I was terribly upset because I had Devontae Smith playing in the flex spot, but I would have liked to have started him over Brandon Ayuk, which I will be doing this week. I will be benching Ayuk this week in my redraft league because I need to see just a little bit more out of him. I know it's there, but he's coming back late in the league, and I just need a little bit of a buffer. I think Godwin's going to do what he did last week again. He looked good. I think he caught all his passes that came his way, which was bananas across the board. It's just bananas. Hold on, let me. I'll pull it up right here. Yep. So Chris Godwin, 100% catch rate, 8 of 8. That's ridiculous, right? Waddle is another one that did it. He caught 5 of 5, and then you have Juwan Jennings and Jamar Chase each with 100 clear on terms of targets to catches. But it just says a lot because Godwin just had a really, really, really good game, and he was doing everything right on that field in the slot. If he is available in your league, he's probably not. He's going to be worth grabbing. I think there is a very, very good chance that he finishes as a solid wide receiver too.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. He's one of the people that we were targeting in the mid rounds there. If you got him, he's going to be one of the top flex players this season.
Yep. For those of you that are able to pick him up, I would definitely look into him. All right, what do you got for our duds?
Yeah, so for our duds at wide receiver, I think we have to split them up into 2 camps. We have, wide receivers that you probably took in the top 3 rounds that you're starting and hanging on to no matter what. You have to hope week 1 was a fluke. And then we have wide receivers who are just on awful offenses, look terrible, situation looks terrible. In that first camp of people who were hanging on to, obviously we had guys like Marvin Harrison Jr., Drake London, and Chris Olave. All of them were deeply disappointing if you had them in your starting lineup this week. Especially, I'm going to say Olave was the most disappointing. Because the Saints put up 47 points, and he only put up 3 fantasy points for your lineup. So I don't think the Saints are going to win and put up 47 points most weeks. So I am a little concerned for Olave there.
Yeah, it was alarming. He was out there for over 78% of the snaps. So it's not like he wasn't on the field. I don't understand why. I mean, he wasn't even targeted. Like, if you look at it, like, he wasn't even getting thrown the ball. So I don't know if he was just drawing coverage and opening up the field, because I didn't really watch the game. or what the case was, but everyone else got a piece for the most part. And that's what was alarming about all of it, because we all know the talent that Olave has. There's a reason he's been drafted where he was and how high he goes in fantasy this year. He's usually in the top 2 rounds, if not definitely in the 3rd round. It was definitely alarming. But if I was to, I'd still be starting him no matter what. Going into this week, I'd be starting Olave. If the other 2 I have, I don't know if I'd be starting them.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'd start Marvin Harrison Jr. this week. To be honest, in Dynasty, he'd probably be on my bench. And I'd wait to see another week and put in someone else. In my redraft league, if I drafted him in the first 3 rounds, I kind of don't have a choice. But if I have someone like a Chris Godwin on the bench, I'd be starting him in place of Marvin Harrison Jr. Because the Cardinals' offense did not look great outside of James Conner.
That's fair, but the Buffalo Bills defense last year was the 4th best defense against outside X wide receivers, which is the exact role Marvin Harrison had in that game.
Yep.
They forced the Cardinals to play underneath, where Greg Dortch got 8 targets, McBride got 9 targets. It wasn't a good game. It was super windy in Buffalo for that game too, so that's something to kind of call out there. I think he'll have better games. I think he'll grow into the offense.
Yeah.
I'm probably starting him this week just because you drafted him in the 1st or 2nd round. Like, you almost feel obligated.
Are you starting Drake London?
I mean, Pittsburgh, it could be a case where Pittsburgh's just a really good defense. That's always possible. Look, I'm not excited about starting any of these guys this week.
And he's another top 2 round pick.
It depends on how deep your leagues are. For 12-man deep leagues or 14-team leagues, you're probably starting these guys regardless. You just don't have a choice.
Yeah.
If you have a guy like Godwin that you could fill in, or Jameson Williams that you could fill in one of these spots instead for a week, I probably do that. But again, that's like a 10-team format.
Yeah, I'd be remiss if I would be excited about starting Drake London or Marvin Harrison or Olave. But if I was to pick 3, Olave is the one I lean to. The Falcons looked anemic. It was rough. The defense zoomed in on Bijan, and Bijan had an okay game when it came down to it, but Kirk couldn't get the ball down the field. And we were talking about this beforehand, like his footing seemed off. It brings into question the injury, whether or not he's back to 100%. We don't know. His mechanics were different. He was lining up differently. He was sitting in a neutral position instead of a step back on his plant foot. It was very weird to watch him play. Now, he also hasn't played. Like, it's another scenario where he was out pretty much all of last year. He didn't play in the preseason. And you have to take that into account. Is he just shaking off rust and getting his things together? Is he not at 100%? I don't know. But that leans into the, I'm going to avoid the offense of the Falcons if I can. All right, yeah, so those are probably what I would do, just to avoid some of those receivers. If you got people to replace, definitely jump into it. How about you jump into the running backs?
Yeah, for our stud running backs for the week, we had Saquon Barkley, Joe Mixon, and J.K. Dobbins. Mixon, again, we already spoke about him. He's a stud, great offense. He's going to get a ton of carries and probably goal line touchdowns there. The other 2, though, I think it's great to see back. They're both kind of a little bit of comeback stories here. Saquon was obviously kind of disappointing last year in the Giants' offense because he was the only piece of that offense that defenses cared about, and they just stacked the box against him. Their O-line was terrible. He couldn't move the ball. It was so exciting to see him in the Eagles, though, behind a good O-line, in a good offense. He looked sharp. He still had his burst. He still has his top-end speed. He had 3 touchdowns, which I think might hurt Jalen Hurts' value long-term a little bit in fantasy this year, but Barkley was an absolute stud, and I'm sure you have some thoughts on Barkley being a bird now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with those takes. Like, Barkley was obviously someone we were hyped on coming in, and as a Birds fan, we were definitely in a state of being super excited about what he did. coming in with 31.2. He led all RBs. Obviously, you mentioned Dobbins. Dobbins was funny to watch, in my opinion. He obviously had a really good game. He was light years better than Gus Bus back there. It was actually hard to watch. I know he got majority of his points on 2 long rushes. You could tell his legs aren't all there. And that's the one thing that maybe you have a little bit of a concern about. If you watch his long run, you'll see him towards the end, he grabs the ball like this because he knows he's probably going to get hit, even though the touchdown's 10, 15 yards in front of him. But he wants to hold on to the ball. And that says a lot. He's not all there, but you could see what he is capable of, which I think is the biggest piece to take away from what you saw from Dobbins. And I'm not going to get into Mixon because Mixon speaks for himself and what we saw.
Yeah, and as far as Dobbins goes too, just to see his usage as that clear RB1 in LA was the main thing I was looking for in that backfield. So it's good to see that someone kind of took that step forward, and it's not going to be this ambiguous backfield, I think, next week. Mm-hmm. As far as a dud, though, in kind of an ambiguous backfield, we have Javonte Williams as our biggest stud running back for the week. He had a very weird offseason where he got hyped up a little bit in camp. Then it kind of went back to he might not even make the roster at the beginning of the summer here. And then he's 10 pounds later and he's a stud and he's great and all this thing. So it was a very weird offseason for the Denver running back corp there. He came in, he didn't get a ton of work. The Broncos just looked terrible as an offense. They couldn't really get much going in the ground or through the air. I just don't think they're going to be a viable offense again unless Bo Nix really becomes a much, much better quarterback in the next couple of weeks, which he might be okay, but I'm not expecting anything amazing out of this offense.
Yeah, there's not much more to say about him. He's clearly fringe. McLaughlin clearly got the dominant share on the Broncos, but starting anybody in that offense, you'd be a fool. Even Cortland Sutton. I'd be very hard pressed to be starting Cortland Sutton after watching Denver overall in Week 1. Now, they have potential. There's definitely upside. They're young, and they have some solid rookies on that team that could end up panning out into something decent over time. But I would be avoiding them like the plague. All right, let's jump into our last piece for studs and duds here, and we're going to do tight ends.
Yeah, and this is a guy we already talked about a lot. He's probably in every single tight end reaction video right now, but Isaiah Likely was the clear stud tight end of the week. I think he was the only tight end this week to score more than 15 fantasy points, and the number 2 guy was Foster Moreau. So, again, it's a bit of a wait-and-see scenario, but if he's on your waiver wire, I'm throwing a good amount of fab in him. I want him on my team just because that upside is so high, especially if Andrews did get hurt again and miss any time. He's a clear tight end 1 in that scenario. Mm-hmm. And even with Andrews, I think he's going to put up production, maybe just not 24, 25 points every single week.
Yeah. Likely is clearly by and far the winner in terms of studs. You can't name anyone else as a stud. The tight end position was not good from the fantasy perspective for just about anybody that you started, including the ones that you expect to be the ones that perform. As you go into the duds, it tells it all. Because those tight ends that you expected to be at the top of the list were not.
You could have put a number of names for the dud candidate for tight ends. Andrews, Kelce didn't have a particularly good week. Engram was bad. Ferguson got hurt. No one was really good. But we went with the most disappointing, I think, was Dalton Kincaid, given the matchup against a terrible Cardinals defense. There wasn't really a clear wide receiver one in the Bills' offense going into the week, and there were hopes that he would be that number one target.
Mm-hmm.
I think you got to wait and see. This could change. He's still one of my top 5 tight ends for the rest of the season here. It was just a really disappointing start to the season for Kincaid, but I'm hoping that changes as time goes on.
It was really alarming. As we said, with the wide receiver core at Buffalo, people expected Kincaid to be heavily used. His snap share was fine. From that perspective, like he was clearly on the field, but there was just no scenario where he was something to worry about on the offensive side of things. He did not get a ton of targets. He was only targeted twice. He caught one pass for 11 yards. I think the alarming thing to me is if you look at his year last year, he had 73 catches, 673 yards, and only 2 touchdowns. He replaced Dawson Knox when he was drafted. Knox was a decently performing tight end when they decided to take Kincaid, because Kincaid coming out of college was obviously touted that he was going to be a really good player, right? I haven't seen it yet. I don't think he was that great last year. He was okay. As far as tight end, 673 yards, 73 catches, it's okay. It's not a top 5 tight end, which is what people are expecting him to be, and he was drafted as such. So it was a little alarming from that perspective, which is why he definitely falls into the dud scenario. I know you probably drafted him in the top 5 rounds in fantasy. If you drafted a tight end, there's a good chance he was in there. He's one of those that I would probably start because of where I picked him, but otherwise I don't know if I'd be starting him this week. I'd probably be looking for a fill-in till I have a better grasp on Buffalo's offense and what they're doing outside of Josh Allen rushing in touchdowns.
Well, unless your fill-in is Isaiah Likely, Brock Bowers, or Sam Laporta. I'm not sure who you're putting in his place. That's the thing with tight ends. It's such a shallow position.
I'd start Goddard over him.
Yeah, I guess. I don't think you're an Eagles fan, though. We're a little biased. I don't think many people are excited to start Goddard over Dalton Kincaid in almost any scenario.
I mean, it's not so much that I'm an Eagles fan, but you know he's the third option, and he's going to get catches. I mean, even Zach Ertz had more points.
Yeah, I mean, again,
Lincoln City had more points. Granted, he got robbed of a really good catch in the end zone, which was really telling. Taysom Hill is probably someone I would look to potentially start over him too.
Yeah,
Hill's going to get his.
He can. Hill's one of those players that he scores 3 points or 32 points.
Yeah.
I think I roll with Kincaid one more week before I really hit the panic button there.
Sure.
He outsnapped, Dawson Knox. It's not that Dawson Knox had 6 targets. If that were the case, I would agree with you. I'd start, hitting the panic button now.
Yeah.
I think just with how he's drafted and who's available, you have to roll with him a little bit longer, but he's one to keep an eye on for sure.
All right, I got 2 more here that we did not mention that I think are just people that we'd be remiss if we didn't bring up. 1 stud and 1 dud. The last dud that I'm putting out there is the Commanders. I just listened to the entire team outside of Jaden Daniels, but really who I'm focusing in on is McLaurin. I'd be avoiding that wide receiver core, especially McLaurin right now, like the plague. I don't know what we're going to see in the passing game when it comes to Jaden Daniels right now. I know he's got an arm. I know the potential is there, but as a rookie and what I saw in week 1, I would avoid Scary Terry right now because it's just a shame. I just don't think he's going to perform to where he's capable of performing because of the situation.
Yeah, it's another disappointing one. I was hopeful that Terry might be good this year with Jaden Daniels coming in. And maybe he gets better. Like we said, Jaden Daniels did not look like anything special when it comes to a passer of the football. Obviously, great rushing upside, but that does not help Terry McLaurin. The one guy that I'll say in Washington that I would probably, consider for a flex spot is Brian Robinson.
Sure.
It looks like he does have the goal line role. I think he's the clear RB1 over Eckler in that offense. I think he is startable, but outside of him and Daniels, I agree. I'm avoiding this offense completely here. And Robinson is a matchup-based flex play for me at best.
Yeah, it's just not a good scenario, and I'd almost be starting anyone who goes against that defense. I'm sure in some of our start set videos, we'll probably be picking on them a lot. And then my last one, the stud that you didn't bring up in your list, Kamara. Everyone hating, they're like, oh, he's old, he's not going to do anything. What did I say? He's going to be a monster. He comes in, has a great first game, more than you could ask for in every single way you could possibly ask. Now, I know the Saints literally took a crap, right? And they just pooped all over. I feel so bad because I feel like we just keep crapping on them. But it's a scenario where the Saints just walked all over them, and I know that opened up the, in every sense of the word, the offensive capabilities of the Saints over the Panthers, who was just, to the wall when it came down to it. But Kamara just looked good. He's clearly a PPR fit. He was one of the few that managed to score more than 20 points. And I know a lot of people avoided him. In redraft leagues, he was going late. In dynasty leagues, people are going, oh, he's cooked. I don't see it yet. He still looks similar to Joe Mixon, who came out and was like, yeah, I might be older, but look at me. I'm rushing all over the field. And I think it said a lot of what he is still capable of. And, I really enjoyed seeing it, to be honest.
Yeah.
He averaged 5.5 yards per carry.
He's obviously much better than where he was drafted. The only issue is he doesn't get to play the Panthers every single week.
That's true.
So I think he's going to be very good for where he's drafted. If you got him, you got him for a discount, obviously. It's I'd like to see how he performs against a different team before I crown him as a league winner. But as of right now, he did look very good, and obviously did not look washed yet.
Yeah, there was no signs of fatigue on those wheels. So it was really, really cool to see watching him come out of the gate, because I wasn't expecting 20 points from him. Definitely got more than I expected, which I will happily accept on my two fantasy teams that I have him on. But all right, I think with that said, we can wrap this guy up, guys. We would love to know your thoughts on the different takes that we had in this video. We think that week one, overall, while we love the fact that fantasy football was back, it looked like a lot of the teams were not out of preseason yet, and they were still trying to figure out what they were going to do this year, or just shaking off the rust overall. But we're looking forward to, obviously, some of the next videos, the next few weeks of fantasy, and we will be back here doing this as consistently as we possibly can. See you guys.